Welcome back to This Is Fine. I'm your host, Matt Triner, CEO of Hunter Strategy, here to guide you through yet another thrilling episode that might just make you rethink your tech priorities. Today, we're plunging into the ominous world of the team death spiral. Let's face it, team death spiral is not the next Marvel blockbuster, although it probably should be. It's the sneaky, scary monster lurking in the shadows of tech debt, gobbling up efficiency and leaving chaos in its wake. Joining me to shed some light on this terror are the triumphant trio from Hunter Strategy: Greg Venor, our Director of Software Engineering, Scott Hyland, our Director of Platform Engineering, and Jeff Siegel, our CTO. So what signs should you be on the lookout for? How could you prevent your team from getting sucked into the spiral of doom? And most importantly, how do you reclaim your sanity and your precious resources once you're in the thick of it? Get ready to decode the secrets to break the cycle and emerge victorious against the team death spiral. Welcome, gentlemen. So I'll admit that when we first proposed this episode, I wasn't familiar with the term. And as it got described through kind of our back and forth, I realized I'm very familiar with what that is. And so if someone could kick off with what is the team death spiral and what are some warning signs that your team might be headed in this direction?
I mean, I have a definition that's very simple, if you don't mind, which is just that when the product gets worse over time and not better, that's sort of an observable phenomenon. And it's pretty likely that I think that something bad is happening with the team. Of course, always strive here to, even if we're starting from a bad place or for whatever reason, whether it's our own doing or we inherited, a troubled situation, we try to make things better. So if that's not if things are actively getting worse, it's time to intervene. So warning signs. So that's maybe how observable from the outside. Warning signs you can look at on the inside of the team. I mean, maybe the most important thing is like if team members don't fundamentally believe that their work matters. I mean, I know I've been doing this. All of us here have been doing this for at least 2 decades. And we've probably been in those situations. And it's really discouraging because usually we're all pretty passionate about what we like to solve problems. It's just sort of like building Lego sets. It's almost the end result is like, yeah, that's nice. But like just the act of the building is fun and we recognize, hey, we are really solving problems. But then if you feel like you do this cool stuff and, it just sort of gets thrown to the trash or just somehow it doesn't seem to matter, it's highly discouraging. And ultimately, like the output from people like us is just going to go down because people, what's the point? So I think that's really the big one. For sure, there's other things like just if people on the team are afraid to communicate openly, if there's like toxic personalities, there's a lot of other things like that. I'm sure what else here has their own signs like that. But I think that's how I would answer that first question.
I really like your definition, Jeff. In fact, I was going to go with a definition like when your team is reporting that they don't have time to work more efficiently would be you're in the team death spiral. But I realized from your definition that that's actually one of the symptoms and not really like necessarily a definition.
Whether or not you're able to make the mortgage on your technical debt.
It's a good one.
So and I think that it's probably important that we define it a little bit, or let's talk about some of the symptoms a little bit, because I think that a lot of people, and I've worked for many, hear technical debt and just hear that's developers whining about things that don't matter for end users. And I think that there's a very real like human connection that people can make. And Scott, you do some of my favorite kinetic references when trying to explain this to people. And there's a better analogy here, and that's why I tapped you, Scott, because you'll come up with it. But it's kind of like when I keep changing gaskets in my car, but like I absolutely have an underlying engine problem. And like, yeah, I can keep oil flowing through the carburetor. Pretty sure that's where oil goes through. I'm not a car guy, but no, I'm kidding. But you can fix these symptomatic things in your vehicle without fixing the underlying problem. But the cost of replacing your engine is so much, and the cost of fixing these smaller things that stop the clanking noise is so reasonable, and eventually your engine seizes up and you need to replace the entire car. And I don't know that the analogy fully makes sense there, because software is a heck of a lot more modular than car parts, but I think it's about as close as people could understand. And I think that there's just too often, and this just isn't unique to the government, feature demands, customer demands, and limited budgets to pay down tech debt are really a real problem that software engineers face everywhere. And I want to figure out, how do we explain to listeners that are either those managers that are earnestly trying to figure out how to connect with their developers, or developers that don't know how to communicate to their manager why this is such a terrible idea, but know that they're frustrated.
I mean, you know, don't ignore the biggest issue, and it's not just whether you have good leadership, it's whether leadership is even allowed. Going back to the old quote of a bad system will defeat a good person every time. And sometimes it isn't that the leader is a bad leader, it's that the system doesn't allow them to do what's necessary, in order to prevent or break the death spiral. Sometimes you just find yourself in a situation where the best thing you can do is bail water, but you find yourself sitting next to three other people in the rowboat, and you know they haven't even decided that the boat's sinking. They're just like, we haven't got to the next step, which is like, so should we bail with our hats, little tiny Coke caps, or should we bail with, a bucket? They haven't even decided that there's water coming in. And again, that's just a symptom of the system or the organization, and not necessarily the issue with individual leaders or managers. Um, can you lead? Are you allowed to lead? That's an important question for the death spiral.
Yeah. Scott, I love that. The whole part of not even deciding that water's coming into the boat. I had also thought of the bailing water analogy, and this is a recent thing for me on a project that I've had some touch points with. And the situation there was, the people who work the project think that the things they're doing are bailing water out of the boat, but they're not in a boat. They're in a house with a burst pipe. And what they need to do is run into the basement and shut the water off. And they're so busy bailing, they don't understand that all they need to do is go downstairs and shut the water off, fix the issue, and turn the water back on.
So that's crazy talk.
Yeah.
And
You know what I mean, though, right?
yeah, absolutely. And Matt mentioned in the beginning this, we're talking about tech debt and sort of like and Scott also talked, define the death spiral around mortgage, being unable to pay the mortgage. And I think, yeah, it's so specifically to Matt's point on, developers are whining about tech debt. It's almost like the premise of that is wrong. Like, you're already in a you're already in a losing defensive posture if you're sort of like going and saying, oh please let us work on tech debt. That's implicitly acknowledging that no business value will ever come from this. This is just a thing that we do to keep the developers happy from rioting and just being really upset comes from it. It's not direct, maybe. It'll take time, but if you have a long-term interest in making the product better over time, or mitigating it from getting worse, you have to do it. You just have to do it. And so there's a tax, whether it's 2%, 5%, 20%, there's some amount of just ongoing maintenance that you're going to have to pay, and you can pay it over time, or you can let it build up and then have a catastrophe. And so hopefully somebody has a long-term mindset. Hopefully somebody involved is not saying, well, I'm set to retire in 18 months, so I don't want to fight this fight. Somebody else can just deal with the catastrophe. Probably not going to happen for 2 years.
You bring up memories for me too, Jeff. I mean,
Yeah.
There's a lot of room in the statement, that, and it's not just about retirement, but it's ultimately about the team's buy-in. And if you're always on your back foot about keeping your developers happy, then there's something else wrong about keeping your developers happy. It's like the death spiral is not necessarily a death spiral of, well, we're not paying the folks enough, or we're not giving them work that they appreciate enough. Like, go back to Project Aristotle. Psych safety is key. Like, if you don't have the ability to speak your mind safely, comfortably, then you're going to have problems. Sometimes that's all it is because you can't feel bought in if you're not listened to. And then the next finding in Project Aristotle was dependability. Like, can I depend on my teammates? And again, you go back to the system. Sometimes the system's just bad. Like, if you're hiring 4 points and the most that you can give somebody who you all have to depend on is, you know, what you would pay a junior developer, but you need senior talent, you've got a bad system for filling the roles on the team. Because you can get a very gifted junior person, but they're not going to have the wisdom that they're going to need in order to help pull apart the threads for business processes, to understand, why the hell is COBOL still running here, and the commensurate tech debt that implies. You've got to answer those questions before you move to the next step, which is like, okay, what can I actually touch? What can I measure? What can I improve? Like, well, geez, one, you got to hire people that can do the job first.
Yeah. One real world example, I think, is in terms of maybe like, I thought of this because you mentioned, junior, senior developers would, if you bring somebody on and like being open and honest with people, so they might say, hey, I kept getting pulled into this technology and I'm pretty good at it, but I want to go over here. And so that's what they want. It might have, whether that's aligned with your program is another story. So, but as leaders in this space, like being open to tell that person, great, thanks for that I think that actually does work. Like, need your expertise in this thing you're good at, but maybe don't want to do. But we think we can accommodate without hurting the business, to move you over here, or hurting the program objectives, or not. Like, the answer may be yes, and it may be no, and just showing that person the respect of, like, instead of just kind of not mentioning it and just saying, yeah, we'll just go a year and just see how it goes, and to keep assigning that person the work that they don't really want to do, but they're very good at, and then being shocked when they quit. I think that's ultimately, that's again another sort of one of those death spiral things where maybe if you had just told them, look, it might take us a year, but we're going to get there. And whether that's acceptable for you is another story, but like, let's work through that, and you can at least navigate that. They feel respected because you listen to them, and you can do whatever you have to do that's best for the program and for the business. But at least everybody's operating with kind of trust and respect at that point.
It's
So, one thing I did want to ask the team is what roles do communication and team dynamics play in kind of preventing this from occurring? And one thing that we touched on earlier that I do want to start with as we answer this question is because it feels like the word tech debt has been co-opted to be coded whining for developers, to especially experienced PMs. What are ways that people can communicate debt without using the word? What are ways that people can show business impact? And I really do think, Jeff, you made a really good point earlier. It's like, I reject the premise that the notion of tech debt is inherently some kind of problem for like some kind of problem with developers and not with outcomes. I think that that's a really good point, but let's pretend like the word for many seasoned PMs, especially in government, because there are very few vocational PMs that don't care about outcomes outside of the government. They exist, I'm sure, in big companies and other places, but that's where I think the problem is prolific, because you get told one day you're a flight line officer, and the next day you're a project manager managing quality software for flying, and you did flights, so you're totally qualified for that. And that's something that I want to understand. How can we help people communicate that better?
Tech debt, in some ways, it's like, what do they call it? An unforced error. It's inefficiency that you have to pay every iteration. It's needlessly recurring tasks that could be automated. That opportunity cost might be another good way to put it. There's opportunity cost. You're servicing tech debt instead of improving quality, adding features, or moving towards an actual goal.
Yeah. Um, and referring to it as a set of sustainable practices instead of specifically calling it out as tech debt, and itemizing,
Yeah.
what are these things that are affecting us, and keeping us from doing new feature work. You know, that's the thing too, is it a blocker to greater productivity? If it's a blocker to greater productivity, it's probably tech debt.
Yeah. Well, that's why I use the term team death spiral, because it's when those blockers to productivity and adding new feature becomes so great. You get into projects where it's like, I want to make the button cornflower blue. And then your dev team says, well, that'll be 7 months. And someone goes, why on earth does it take 7 months to change the color of the button? And then you get the, well, here's all the reasons. And it's insane.
It yeah, that's where I always try to go. It's so hard because so many of these things are so abstract and they don't mean anything to anybody, but those things mean a lot. And so, yeah, when communicating, to customers and decision makers, I think that's where you have to go. Just say, this thing that you think is so small is actually this big, and here's why." I mean, how many times have we seen that?
Right. Well, true. But I guess I was more leaning towards the it's unnecessarily large because, of all the tech debt. Yeah. Yeah.
Could be a situation where even without tech debt, that's the case. But
Yeah.
exactly, it's this you're paying exorbitant amount, and you're not really getting anything valuable because that money the resource and time, it's not even going to paying down the debt, right? It's just servicing. So yeah,
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's one of the reasons why the term tech debt was chosen on the basis of trying to communicate with non-technical people to make them understand of debt, servicing the debt, an interest rate on that debt. And I mean, not all tech debt is the same. Maybe one kind of tech debt is a 1% loan and another tech debt is a 10% loan. And maybe we should adopt that kind of language too if we're going to keep using the tech debt term.
exactly. And so one thing Matt asked about in the beginning of this question was just sort of talking about leadership and preventing the death spiral. So what I can say, Greg and I worked at the same company many years back. When I was pretty early in my career, they tapped me to be an IPT lead, which we don't really have anymore. But they didn't really prepare me. I didn't prepare myself, and so, I don't know if the team I was on necessarily went to a death spiral, but I definitely, I think I failed and in part because of those 2 things, because I didn't really know how to be a leader properly, and I didn't have anyone from the organization telling me what I needed to do. I think I was a little unsure, and that was very obvious to the team in retrospect. I think at the time I thought, "I'm I'm a good developer. I'm not a complete incompetent. Like I can do this. Cool. Like, look at me. I'm an IPT lead. And then going, oh, wait a minute. And yeah, that's not good for morale. So I think from the standpoint that we are here now, we need to recognize that we have to be very, very careful not to put our own new leaders into those positions where we give them authority and room to fail, room to succeed, and room to fail, and we just don't even bother trying to help them. So that's something that we have to be very vigilant about, I think.
That particular position, Jeff, was designed to fail because you were told that was waterfall. And it was, you were told, develop these features with this team in this amount of time. You're responsible for success. Bye.
Yes, it didn't help that it was also literally technically impossible what they were trying to, sort of do a thing, a single sign-on thing that's just literally not possible without breaking the whole concept.
But back in the day before Agile, when we were doing waterfall there, was one of my first experiences of the kind of team death spiral type stuff that we're talking about now. Um, we didn't have test automation back then for a lot of projects. TDD was like a new buzzword that had just been invented. Unit tests were a fairly new concept back in that time frame, right? And we could see I could literally see as the IPT lead that, the first time we did our round of manual testing, it was quick because we didn't have a lot to test. And as the software grew, the testing took more and more time. And it got to the point where we needed 2 months to do a full test, but we had a schedule of a 3-month waterfall, which only left 1 month for development. Except you also had to fit your planning in, and they scheduled 2 weeks for that. So this is literally the death spiral.
Yeah.
So what would happen is someone would say, "Well, that's ridiculous. We're just not gonna test because we have to be able to develop these new features." But I mean, right there, if you were actually doing your full regression test in that environment, you would have eventually gotten to the point where you would have just been testing for months after like a couple days of developing new features. And I had people walking around the office basically policing the waterfall principle here. I remember getting yelled at before I was a lead for doing development while we were in a test phase. Someone noticed me working when I was in my office typing away, and I got in trouble because they're like, "You're a developer. You shouldn't be working right now. We're in a test phase."
That's amazing.
Yeah, so good.
That sounds very, you know, foreman on the floor
Yeah,
walking around. Yeah. The
yeah,
the union says that you can't be making brake shoes today.
yeah. Terrible. I mean, this is why we say things like, "You can't be agile without automation," because how do you provide deliverable software at the end of a sprint? You have to be able to test it. And you can't if you have a 2-week sprint and you wanna develop features, you can't say, "Well, we're gonna develop for a day and then spend 9 days of our 10-day sprint testing." You know? You have to be able to click a button and run all your tests.
There's no way to turn the risk cliff into a risk sawtooth if you aren't able to automate, and that's a challenge too that I think if you wanna get a little bit more micro than macro on this, when you're talking about preventing the team death spiral, there are teams, large teams, talented teams, or teams with talent who are utterly at sea when asked how they automate tasks. You'll how do you make a choice on how you're gonna automate and what you're gonna do? And, many of them don't realize, step 1 is write it down. What did you do? And that might just be like history, angle bracket, how I did it, .txt, like, easy. A lot of folks don't know.
Yeah,
They've never really had to automate, and my experiences on the infrastructure side are they just don't know, "Well, how do I even look at what I did and remember it?" And then the flip side is that in development, many of them don't feel the agency or have the understanding they need in order to go and play with the tool. Like, do you have the curiosity and the interest to go and find a tool that does automation for you as you're doing your job? Because for many of them, it's not their job. They've not thought about how you would test or how it matters. Somebody and, this is a symptom of platform engineering right now. Somebody has handed you a repo and access to a repo, and they've given you a process for how to interact with that repo and has told you that whatever type of flow you're gonna use, commit your code, and then if it doesn't work, we're gonna come back and pester you about it. Otherwise, it's out of your hands. Doesn't work. You don't have ownership, you don't have understanding. It's great if you're running I don't know, I hesitate to call it a software factory. It's not really a software factory. It's like a software sweatshop. Um, and all you care about is lines of code and passing tests, passing automated tests that somebody else probably wrote. You might not have even done TDD, and that's it. We're done. See you later. Those folks don't care. They're never gonna meet any of the needed criteria for a high performing team, according to our Project Aristotle. And
Yeah.
you're just going to find yourself deeper and deeper and deeper in the death spiral and deeper in, upside down from a sustainability perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think team death spiral is almost entirely a leadership problem, basically, at the end of the day.
And just to kind of riff off of that, talked about leadership. What strategies could either leadership or technical leadership, and I make that distinction because usually there's a distinction between programmatic or scrum master or somebody on that side and whoever is the development lead on a team. How can those people work to prevent the team from being swallowed into that spiral?
So that's tough, right? Because leadership, when I say that, is very broad. Like, imagine you work in a commercial setting and on some IT internal business application, and your CIO is constantly coming to your team, bypassing the product owner and the maybe the CTO is in charge of it, and he's asking those people to run detailed reports on cloud spend. So the scrum master and the product owner and the individual developers are so far down the chain from the CIO, they're just going to respond, right? And the people who are on that project may not have the ability to kind of like push back against being tasked by the CIO. So then that becomes an issue where you need to, pardon the stupid business expression, raise it up the chain, and try to address that at a higher level in the organization. But that's difficult. You're dealing with personalities. Will the CTO go fight with the CIO over territory and turf? Will the CEO step in and say, stop doing this because the CTO's team can't get anything done because the CIO is coming in and making demands at random? There's lots of nuance and situations here that might end up impacting a team's ability to deliver and meet their goals.
I think, and yeah, from a leadership perspective, definitely all that. I think maybe from the inside the team, what
Yeah.
if you're running a team, I think probably agree much on a lot of these things, and a lot of them are fairly obvious of just like communication, lots and lots and lots of communication, direct messaging, big public conversations, small subject area focused conversations, all of that, showing empathy with everybody on the team, having clear expectations. That's something that I think I have kind of maybe in the middle of my career, in these lead roles, even as I thought I was becoming maybe better leading teams, I still was not doing a good job of setting that for people on the team, and hopefully getting better in terms of just saying, hey, here's where you are now, but this is what we need out of this role. Can you deliver that? Being straightforward, like empathetic and understanding and human, but just also like we have an objective, and like this is what we need here. One thing, this, there's this sort of like work hard, play hard thing, and like that gets, I don't know, it's maybe overstated or something, but the way I think about that is like having fun while we work hard. Like, I think part of it is like we blow off steam and kind of mess around partly because we're actually taking the job so seriously, that like we have to do that. And it's I see it almost as a sign of more seriousness instead of less, because there was a point to which it gets to be like, okay, knuckleheads, let's get to work. But I think we don't do those things, then it actually almost in a sense means people are just like apathetic. They don't really care. They don't really have any interest in getting to know their coworkers as people, and so they're just phoning it in. So
Yeah.
I think it's actually a good like sign to have that going on, because it usually actually means that people really do think of it that way.
Yeah. This entire conversation, one thing that keeps kind of bouncing around in my mind is just individuals and interactions over processes and tools.
1,000%. That's what I always go back to whenever I'm answering questions and proposals or anything, white paper, that kind of. I just go back to that every time. Is like, and there's other parts of the Agile Manifesto and everything, but I don't know. That's what I always circle back to is that one.
Yep.
So, something I did want to talk about, because you talked about empathy before, and that's one of my favorite topics, but I'm always the advocate for empathy for things that people tend not to have empathy for. So, that's going to be in the case of commercial teams, profit. In the case of the government or large organizations, process and security and other pieces that tend to really weigh on a team. And I think that having empathy for those non-human things that are typically one represented by the most annoying human in the team environment being the business or the CISO or in the case of, again, a government thing like the security controls assessor that is dealing with the authorization. And I don't mean that they're personally annoying, but their role is to be annoying. Like, that's their job. If they're doing their job well, they're probably not a very good friend of the team. And it's always great when you have someone that is empathetic back and could not seem that way. And those are my favorite people to work with and favorite people to be when I am those people. But when you're not blessed with that, kind of as a leader, teaching your team empathy for understanding one, yeah, we need to get these features out and balance this against tech debt, or we don't necessarily have jobs. And you can't pull that line every time, everywhere, because then people are just going to go and get new jobs where you don't need to sacrifice tech debt. So there's obviously a balance. But I feel like so often people get pulled into this spiral because you've got mounting pressures from stakeholders, you've got things that, and this is part of the problem with passion and software engineering, is people want to solve problems that don't necessarily contribute to the bottom line or to security or even to real technical debt. Like, that's a real thing to contend with and can be a contributing factor to this spiral. And so I think teaching the team members how to empathize with these non-human things. But then for the non-human things, communication with impact. If you force me to enable FIPS compliance today, you're going to cast our schedule 90 days behind because we're using a particular flavor of GKE that does not do that. Just as an example, that may or may not have happened to me recently. And a lot of times you can, if you know and you're empathetic with the non-human process, you can get them to agree to a 90-day POAM, 120-day POAM, something where you get some relief as long as you show them that you're not blowing them off and you care, because that's kind of the communication part that I think gets missed, because obviously the talent and keeping the talent happy is super important, because without that code, I mean, we're several years away from AI that just write codes for you. Right now, you still need very talented people to sort through Gen AI's code creation and make it actually work. You can maybe use less smart people to do that, but you still need the people. I think we're a long ways away from not needing people. And so taking care of the people is important, but that being that bridge of communication between those what I'll call non-human problems and those human problems is, I think, one of the better ways to, I don't know about preventing it, because I think by the time you're having those discussions, you're starting to spin a little bit. But I think that those are interesting ways to help break out of that, or to kind of stop the early spins that can pull into faster and faster and make it impossible to break. So I do want to jump around because I know all of you guys have had to do those things less intentionally, but I'm curious your thoughts.
I'll speak briefly on empathy and accomplishing things with those team members who might have to be annoying. You do have to be willing to protect the team from jerks, internal and external. Sometimes that means being a jerk yourself, comma, but kindly, where kind doesn't necessarily mean nice or fluffy. It just means, as you were talking about, speaking with intent, like intentional effort to balance the desired outcomes over the long term with a preference for empathic interactions where possible. Because there are times when you have to step on their toes until they apologize. You just have to. There's some people and some organizational structures and some organizational cultures that make that necessary. And it may be unfortunate, but you do have to recognize that occasionally you are going to have to communicate with intent that the person you're communicating with, however empathically you're speaking, is going to perceive it negatively. And you just have to be willing to suck it up and be negative or be perceived as negative in order to accomplish the team's outcomes. Get your goals done, even if you have to like poke somebody with a stick so that they don't, continue to screw things up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, what if you've got some big relational database and you've got your DBA that's been there forever, and they've got a big vested interest from their own career in not changing it. And somebody comes along with some sort of, NoSQL strategy, and everybody's bought in, and agrees, yeah, we got to move forward with that. You got to have a hard conversation with that DBA, and there it's yeah, it's not going to be easy, and you can absolutely empathize with that position, even if doing the right thing for the program is, hey, you know, we got to do this. And can you, it's sort of, the analogy that people use is with coal miners is teach them to code. Is that all that may, that's not obviously, I say that jokingly, is like, it doesn't always work, and that type of strategy. Nonetheless, you have to just do the right thing for the program, for the customer, and to build the best solution, and just you can be empathetic with the human beings that are working on this thing, and if the direction moves in that, if the technology choices move it away from somebody's, you know area of expertise, that's just the way it is. If there's a way for them to still, stay on the program, be gainfully employed and everything, then great. Work with them on that, do what you can, but you can't just let that, if you just sort of let that person halt the progress, then that is another sign, I would say, of a death spiral.
Yeah. I like the concept of empathy to profit. I feel like that's something that I have striven to do in my career that has been beneficial for me personally, and I recommend it to everybody. We exist in companies, unless you work directly for the government. The motive is always profit everywhere. Understand that labor is cost, using resources is cost. If you can get something done more efficiently, faster, use less resources, use fewer licenses, whatever it is, this is going to be received well. And understand that keeping your team overhead low, speaking of team death spiral, keeping your team developing your products in mind with efficient operation and low overhead to maintain also affects the bottom line, right? There's two parts of profit, top line and bottom line. So understanding both of those is like really critical, and it would behoove anyone to really understand those. Yeah.
Justifying value. Like,
Right.
what do you bring to the table? Am I going to get more than I'm putting into it from a
Right.
resources, like, let's just say resources, then it's not profit or anything. It's just from a resources perspective, am I getting more out than I'm putting in?
Yeah. Yeah. If you have if you when you build a microservice architecture and you do it right and you have good observability, including, distributed logging and tracing, and when you have a problem in production, you can solve that in 10 minutes versus spending 3 days solving it. You know, these things really affect the cost of the team and your ability to respond, to change, all those things. These should not be discounted. This is the true reason we tried to adopt DevOps, be the state of the industry what it may. But yeah, all this kind of stuff. And I did want to make a comment about the eager developer who is bored and goes out there and, like you say, make a GET request to this API, and he comes back and be like, "Well, I haven't finished it's been 3 weeks and I finished the new REST framework." And it's like, um, yeah, I should have been watching you more closely. But I mean, I haven't seen that in a long time, but that does happen.
But then I'm curious what your take is though, because well, you and I have probably been on both sides of that.
Yeah.
I remember when I first
Guilty.
when I first started at the shared company, I think, I got some task and I basically ended up like writing my own Java hash map for some reason, not realizing like any.
I think I reviewed this patch from you. I think I know what you're talking about.
So it's your fault. So
Yeah.
you let me do that.
No, 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 well, maybe, I don't remember, but I have some vague recollection.
No, but I'm just curious though what your take is when that happens because, there's some good and there's some bad along with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you say to that person? What would you have said to me?
Um, why didn't you just use HashMap?
Because I didn't know.
I know. I have done the same thing, and that is exactly what happened to me. So, I was, 17 years old, my first job programming, I was doing procedural SQL in an Oracle database, and they needed some function to be implemented. And I'm like, "I've got the book because this is 1990, so there's no, like, going and looking up manuals online. So I've got the book on my desk of procedural SQL, and I write a function to determine the largest value of a column in a table, and you can call the function and pass it in. I'm so proud of myself. I'm so proud, right? I call the manager, my tech lead over, and I show him what I've done, and he says, "That's really cool that you learned all that, and it's awesome, but why didn't you just use Max?" You know? And I think there's the empathy for you, right? Be empathetic to the person and be like, don't be like, "You stupid idiot, there's a max
Right.
function." You gotta, show some kindness there. Like, "That's great. You understand these fundamentals. You had the ability to learn this and implement it. I see you even tested your function. This is all great. Unfortunately, delete it."
Well, and well,
Yeah.
no, because I do want to speak to that for a second because that's another thing that I think unfairly gives developers a bad rap is like, well, you just are doing this for fun or whatever. And unless you have a project manager, a product manager, and a whole chain of management that all just happen to be really talented, senior, wise developers that can help avoid this, whether you're spending it implementing a hash map or max or something that could have been gotten elsewhere, or you're just banging your head against an API that or some issue in a legacy code base for hours and hours, but could have been solved by the one guy person that knew how that worked. I've had these like management discussions with customers when they're like trying to pick apart your sprint and they're like, it took this many days to complete this 3-point task. And I'm trying to explain, like, yeah, this person had to go down a rabbit hole that like was not anticipated and shouldn't have been required. And if you look across any project that's not build me a single static page against a mockup or something, like something incredibly like very finite that like you should just be able to do. And even then, by the way, if the mockup was not made in DOM friendly compliant things, you could end up, just to make pixel perfection, spending hours moving this little modal window or toast pop up to slightly do it. God forbid we start talking about 508 compliance and screen readers and things in addition to that, right? So there's just so many things that come from it. I think that it's part of that empathy back to the manager or the person picking apart the sprint, where I was like, look, I get it's frustrating that you think a developer wastes a bunch of time, and I understand that they're expensive, but if you look across problems that are our fault as a development team and problems that are external in nature, caused by an infrastructure team, legacy code, some type of interface, there's a million reasons. If you have good development leadership and you're also, and I think to use Scott's word before, intentionally a jerk, sometimes a little bit with kindness, and sometimes that means getting rid of an underperformer. Sometimes that means like right sizing your team because the people that are doing the work aren't the right people. And that kindness doesn't mean everybody gets a job forever and everybody gets to be lazy forever. That's not what that's stupidity. That's not kindness. And but the reason that's important is if you know that you're doing that and you're maintaining high performing teams, then you can safely tell your customer problems on our side and problems that are external that we couldn't have prevented are a fucking wash. And there's really no reason, like the amount of time in trying to make those time wastes observable are far worse for culture and creating this spiral than actually just assuming that you can write that off. And there might be some future discussion that we could have, because I know we're coming up on time here, where we could talk about ways to look at that over time and see if there's other metrics where you can determine somebody does this more than other people. There's certainly good intellectual discussions to be had about how to make that work. But I think that's one of the things that I think tech debt why tech debt has gotten this bad rap is because people don't understand, did we make a shortcut because we were doing a thing that everybody agreed with? Or am we re-implementing the concept of rest because Spring came out with a new version and we fucking love Spring? Sorry, Jeff, that wasn't directly to attack on your love of Spring. But, and even then, right, in that example, eventually you gotta upgrade Spring. Eventually that is tech debt because support goes away for the version you have. And that's the balance. That's why this is hard. And you're almost never going to have informed enough management to have that degree of cohesion where it's like, okay, we agree we need to do this. You want to do it next month. I want to do it 6 months from now. But we all agree it needs to be done eventually. And then 6 months from now, we kick it another 6 months and then we're at an EOL. Like that's the kind of thing that happens when you don't have trust in your teams, and why also showing your customer that you have your own performance metrics and you're keeping people on top of things. So I don't want to go too far on a tangent there, but that's something that I think is really important, is having that ability to communicate back with impact and show the impacts and also be able to communicate why measuring this particular ticket in a really scrutinous way is not necessarily going to help you next time at all.
Yep. Yep. It's like keeping your car in good repair is better than buying a new one, right? And but what people do is they treat their software like they treat their cars and wait for the thing to basically have the wheels fall off and the engine explode and steam shoot out both ends. And then they say, time to buy a new car.
And so, you use the example, Matt, of the team where somebody was inspecting a sprint internally. And I'm just gonna say it, like points is points is points is points. Like it means nothing outside of the team.
Yes.
There is absolutely nothing that management can do to improve the performance of a properly resourced and chartered team with a high degree of agency. Any external influence on a team like that can only have negative results or neutral ones. Like, can't make the situation better by pushing harder on it. You just have to make sure that properly chartered, decent agency, and the resources they need. Everything else, you just got to get out of. Leave it alone, let them do their jobs. If there are problems, then examine the charter, the resources, and whether they feel the agency they need to do the good work that they need to do. And sometimes the resources there might be, hey, my PM is just not good at articulating a vision or ruthlessly prioritizing because we recognize we're in a death spiral. Then maybe the PM needs to be talked to individually. Pushing on the team doesn't fix it.
And on that subject of the junior engineer who's really inefficient, but we only discover 3 weeks later that they were spinning their gears the entire time. I mean, I think probably for another podcast, there's a whole discussion on what we do in our industry, how junior engineers make it into the market. I personally think we should have an apprenticeship type situation in our industry, not what we currently do. I've read articles suggesting that if you are a small or medium sized company and you need every single engineer to be productive, you shouldn't even hire juniors, you know, because you won't have the appropriate ability, the bandwidth to basically sync a mid or senior with that junior to mentor them. So, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly an interesting thought. And
Is a good way, but again, that's like, don't push on the team from outside. Make sure that the customer knows that you're pairing,
right.
and that pairing does not mean putting twice as much effort on the same job, because there is value to pairing outside of that.
The
Anyway,
tricky thing
sorry.
is
That's
that
we should have a talk about that.
I know what you're getting at, but I've been in so many teams where, like, especially because us as all consultants, right? When you tell your consultant that you have 6 developers on your team, they're gonna roughly expect 6 full-time engineers of output. So then when you're like, "Well, 2 of them are juniors, so you're paying for 6, but you're kinda getting 4.5 to 5-ish." They don't like that, you know?
They don't like it
It's
if you can't articulate the value, and
exactly,
that's the
exactly.
challenge is, can you have a nuanced discussion with someone who has got no experience in software development? The answer is often no. And
Yeah.
if you, as the leader in that position, can turn it into a black box and say, hey, we'll get you the stuff. We have our method. Our method involves X, Y, and Z buzzwords, and we're going to charge you $2 million for it. And if they don't like it, that's fine. You can point at your book of,
I totally agree, and we could have a whole other podcast on how much I hate FFP, because FFP should be a black box. Here's money, give us result. But no, they wanna stick their fingers in how the pie gets made, even though that's a pure contract arrangement, but yeah,
a point
not for
is a day, right, Greg?
So one thing that I just wanted to end on, because it's less about the something you said, Scott, that made me think of this recently, because it came up that somebody talked about this in like a group thread that I'm on, and you talked about properly resourced teams with the right agency. And an example that I heard recently, I haven't actually confirmed it, but I believe it to be true, was that a couple years back, DARPA was brought in front of Congress as a matter of success of like being a successful innovation pathway and bringing net new things to DoD. And they were basically asked, what would happen if we doubled your budget? Could you like do better? Right? Could you do more? And effectively, DARPA was like, please don't do that. We could not spend that amount of money responsibly and create more results. And I think that is just certainly a very macro Congress, a whole agency as opposed to a project. But I think it's basically the same thing as saying this is an organization that's been given the right agency, the right charter, the right resourcing, and overall when offered a bunch more money, they were like, yeah, that is not going to do anything to make us any better or maybe in small individual ways or certain aspects of agency or certain, that's when you get into the FFP of it all, of like there might be some better ways to orchestrate smaller aspects of it. But fundamentally, I've never heard of a government agency before being like, yeah, please don't give us more money. That would not go well. And I think that really shows an example of a place that's doing what it's supposed to be doing if people are not asking for more resources. And so I think that's just something to think about for people that are listening here, is that if your team is constantly asking for resources, do you have the right team? Is your team in a spiral right now and trying to figure out how to get out of it by throwing resources at the problem? Did you have bad assumptions and not give them the agency or the resources they needed in the first place? Because that happens all the time. Back to the FFP thing that Greg mentioned, people bid to win, and sometimes they mean they don't have the resources that they need to start. Or the government did not describe the requirement in a way that was meaningful, and you get there and it's, oh my God, I have all these other things to do that were in no way described in the solicitation, and I'm not going to ask for more money because that just means it looks like I low bid it, even though I did bid it in good faith on what you said. And the person in charge of it is going to point to other duties as assigned in the SOW as why this is perfectly reasonable and you should just keep doing it. So I think that's just an interesting note to kind of conclude on, which is to say that these problems are real. You can't solve them with money. And a great indicator that your team is doing well is if they're not asking for money, or they're asking for changes in structure instead of money or instead of resources. They're asking to change impactful things as opposed to resourcing, because those are we've talked about how do you know things are going badly, but I think that's a really good way to see how things are going well. Well, with that, I think we're a little over time here. So this has been another episode of This Is Fine. Gentlemen, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.